Good evening and welcome. I'm Melissa Doyle. This is the latest from 7 News. As we go to air, there is crisis and chaos right across the US. We have reporters from LA on the West Coast to Minneapolis in Middle America and New York and DC in the East as the violence enters its 7th day. 4 people have been killed. More than 4,000 have been arrested as violent demonstrations rage in around 75 cities. Curfews have been imposed in nearly 40 of them. It is now the most widespread racial turbulence since the assassination of Martin Luther King in 1968, all in the midst of a global pandemic. But we begin tonight in Minneapolis, the epicentre of this violence, where the protests were sparked by the death of George Floyd at the hands of police almost 1 week ago. NBC correspondent Jay Gray is there for us tonight. Jay, the Floyd family was able to connect with the Chief of Police during a CNN interview. Let's just have a look at that.
I want to know if he's going to get justice for my brother and arrest all the officers.
And this is the Floyd family right now?
This is the Floyd family.
To the Floyd family, being silent or not intervening, to me, you're complicit.
Yeah, that is just astonishing, isn't it? Now, where you are, the National Guard's moved in. What's the situation there right now?
Well, you know, large pockets of this city, Mel, are either boarded up or burned out, as you can see behind me here. But for the first time overnight since George Floyd's death, which was exactly a week ago today, there was a bit of calm across this community. We had no serious violence, no major damage, no fires for the first time. And a lot of that's being attributed to that show of force. The National Guard, police officers, sheriffs, deputies on the ground here, and really making sure that come curfew time, they close things down. Now, there were dozens of arrests, but that was for violating curfew. What you hear from protesters is we're going to continue here to have peaceful demonstrations. What you hear from those law enforcement officials is we're going to make sure they stay peaceful.
Jay, while you're speaking, we're looking at shocking video of a truck ploughing into a crowd of protesters. Do we know yet if that was deliberate?
We don't at this point, and boy, it's amazing when you see that video to understand that no one was seriously injured. The truck barreling into a crowd of 1,000, maybe 2,000 people that were on a closed-down highway, closed down for the purpose of protesting. The driver of that truck is in custody, police custody right now, though there's been no indication of charges yet. We know that the tanker was blaring its horn as it moved in, and there are some who speculate that the driver just got confused, was in the wrong place at the wrong time. But again, we're waiting to hear more from officials here.
Yeah, God, you hope that's all it was. Can I just ask before I let you go, can you show us a little bit about, show me around where you are and what it's like behind you?
Yeah, if you want to take a look real quick, I can show you. And this, unfortunately, Mel, is a scene that's playing out really across this entire community. But it's buildings that are just ravaged. The flames so intense that they've melted everything except the metal and some of the concrete and brick here. You can see it builds up and 3 stories high at one point here. And again, unfortunately, this is just a scene that you see across this entire area right now, and really across the entire nation. We've seen fires, we've seen devastation from Los Angeles through New York, and while things do seem to be trending in the right direction here, as we talked about earlier, it seems the outrage is actually growing right now across the country.
Those scenes are just, we can't wrap our head around. It's horrific. Jay, thank you for joining us in Minneapolis this evening. Jay Gray, thank you.
Yeah. Thanks.
Well, to the West Coast now, and much of Los Angeles has been up in flames. Police stations and cars set alight as the National Guard was unleashed on turbulent protesters. Let's go to 7 News US correspondent Paul Caddick, who is there for us now. Well, Paul, have protesters respected the curfew there?
Good evening, Mel. Well, finally there is some order here on the streets of Santa Monica on the coast of Los Angeles, but only after hours of work by authorities here. The days here started with a boisterous but peaceful rally for George Floyd, but then about an hour or so into that we saw another group appear, and they were targeting stores. They were looters, damaging stores, smashing windows. There was a smash and grab going on. We also saw people being attacked in the streets as mobs moved around. Now that saw a big response from authorities. Police were called in from other parts of Los Angeles. The National Guard was called in and a curfew was put in place, but it still took hours to clear those streets. Now we have a situation where firefighters can finally get in and put out fires, make sure they're out, fires that were started a bit earlier, and shop owners can come in and start boarding up windows. Some are actually staying in their businesses tonight with baseball bats and guns, just to make sure that they can fend off anyone who might try to take advantage.
Yeah, it's just unbelievable, these images. How widespread across the whole city are these protests?
Well, Santa Monica bore the brunt today, but we also saw in another part of LA, down in Long Beach, later in the day, we saw another rally that turned violent. We saw convoys of looters swoop in and target local shopping centres down there. Again, the National Guard had to respond. There was an alert put out for any extra police in the greater LA region to respond to that. Also had fire destroy a building down there in all the chaos down there. That has thankfully been brought under control as well. And also a big rally in downtown Los Angeles again tonight. City Hall needed to be guarded by police and National Guard troopers. The situation there not as bad though as we've seen in downtown LA for the last couple of days. So more areas of LA today will tomorrow morning have a big clean-up to deal with, and I suppose the whole city is now wondering, is this finally over or is there more of it to come?
Oh gosh, we hope over. Paul, thanks very much. Paul Caddick. And there have also been extraordinary scenes in New York City tonight, with protests there turning violent and looting in famous shopping districts right across Manhattan. That is where we find Will Denslow for us tonight. And Will, protests began peacefully during the day, but violence broke out after dark. Now that the sun is up, what's the latest there?
Well, Mel, New York is really trying to take stock of what happened after another night of pockets of extreme violence in this city. I'm here at the Barclays Center in Brooklyn, New York, which has been seen to several nights of demonstrations. There was certainly seemingly a change in mood on Sunday evening compared to Friday, where there's plenty of bottle throwing at police who responded in kind with pepper spray at protesters, with a number of arrests. And on Sunday night, there was somewhat of a different kind of a feel, with community leaders taking more of an active role. But after dark, plenty of arrests. According to police figures, around 250 arrests in New York City. There are reports and videos showing dumpsters being burnt across New York City. And Soho, the famous shopping district that you so rightly mentioned, Mel, in Manhattan, shops like Gucci vandalized. And we've heard from police officials here that have really blamed not the bulk of demonstrators that have been, for the most part, peaceful here in the city, instead blaming well-organized groups and out-of-town anarchists. So very troubling developments coming from the New York Police Department as these demonstrations continue here in the city.
Absolutely. All right. Well, thank you, Will Denslow, joining us in New York tonight. And the violence has made it right to Donald Trump's door. The president rushed to an underground bunker as protesters clashed with police outside the White House. Let's get the latest from America's capital city now, Washington, D.C., where CNN's Jeremy Diamond is standing by. Jeremy, authorities have used tear gas, pepper spray, flashbang grenades to disperse crowds. What's the situation there now?
Yeah, Melissa, we had one of those scenes last night that we've seen over the last 3 nights in Washington, D.C. Peaceful protests during the day, hundreds and hundreds of people flocking just outside of the White House. And then at night, around 10 p.m. last night, things began to change, turning a little bit more violent and with some looting that took place in Washington, D.C. We are now about a block away from the White House at the headquarters of the AFL-CIO, which is the largest federation of unions in the United States. This is the headquarters. And let me just take you over here, Melissa. You can see the building here has been completely completely demolished, the front of it at least. All of these windows smashed out. There was actually a fire in the lobby of this building. You can see cleanup crews now taking care of the damage. This is just one of the scenes that we have seen here in Washington, D.C. Several buildings in this area have also been broken into. There was some looting that took place in the streets of Washington, D.C., and also some cars that were set on fire. Several cars in this area. We could still smell the smoke this morning as we arrived on the scene to see what the aftermath was. I also want to note that just down the block from us, there is a church, St. John's Episcopal. It's a church that has been every president since James Madison has attended at least one service there. The basement of that church was actually also on fire yesterday evening. That fire was thankfully put out, and the church itself did not suffer major damage. But again, this is the aftermath of what we have seen in Washington, D.C., perhaps the worst damage of these last 3 nights. But each of these last 3 nights, we have seen peaceful protests during the day. And then at some point in the evening, things turn as the confrontations with the police heat up, fires are set, and buildings are broken into. And so this is the aftermath here in Washington.
That is just, the damage is so extensive. The president, Donald Trump, is reported to have fled into a bunker. Is he still there?
Yeah, so this actually was just on Friday night. It was briefly, the president was taken to a secret underground bunker under the White House for nearly an hour. Protests on Friday night, actually, even though perhaps the damage was not as bad as what we are seeing now. On Friday night, the protesters were actually much closer to the White House. There's a park right in front of Pennsylvania Avenue outside the White House. Protesters were in that park and actually getting closer to the White House's north lawn fence. It was at that moment that we are told that the president, the First Lady Melania Trump, and their son, Barron Trump, who also lives with them at the White House, were taken to this underground bunker for nearly an hour. Pretty extraordinary circumstances have to happen in order to actually get the president to go into that underground bunker. The president on Saturday morning, we know, had tweeted about how he felt safe the entire time that these protests were happening. Now we know why he felt so safe, because he was indeed in that underground bunker. We do know, though, that as these protests happened again Saturday night and then on Sunday night, the Secret Service established a much broader perimeter around the White House, actually pushing those protesters outside of Lafayette Park so that there was at least this entire park, at least a block's length between the protesters and the White House. So no word as of yet that the president had to be rushed to that bunker once again. Melissa?
All right, thank you for that update from Washington, D.C., Jeremy Diamond. Well, Donald Trump is blaming the violence on domestic terrorism. NBC correspondent Tracy Potts is in Washington, D.C. And Tracy, Trump has been accused of inflaming the situation.
Exactly, because some of the comments that he's made, Mel, about thugs being part of these demonstrations, about police meeting looting with shooting, aren't sitting well with people who say that the president needs to more clearly delineate people who are peacefully protesting with people who are looting and breaking the law. And even some of his inside advisors and other Republicans, those members of his party, have suggested that the president needs to be publicly more empathetic with people who are demonstrating, with African Americans and their experience, and this issue between African Americans and the police, and how many people have died at the hands of police. But the president, according to our sources, has rejected that and continues to make these many consider inflammatory.
Yeah, wow. Tracy, just tell us what Antifa is and why it's been designated as a terrorist organisation.
Yeah, Antifa is a leftist group, a far left of many Democrats, and the Trump administration thinks that they are involved in a lot of these demonstrations, that they're coming in as outsiders, inflaming peaceful demonstrations and turning them violent. As a result, the president announced that the U.S. will designate them as a terrorist organization. Problem with that is that's a designation for foreign groups. This is a domestic group. They have First Amendment rights. They can demonstrate and talk about their views that may be wildly different from the administration. And so there are constitutional experts who are questioning whether the government can actually do that at all.
God. All right, Tracy Potts there in Washington, D.C., thank you for that update. Now, the race riots in America have sparked protests in Europe, with crowds of people breaking social distancing rules across the continent. In the UK, violence has broken out too. Europe Bureau Chief Hugh Whitfield is live in London for us this evening. And Hugh, London police have already arrested 23 people.
Yeah, Mel, we're at the US Embassy where the protest ended, but it began about 3 kilometres away in Trafalgar Square. Thousands of people gathering there in breach of the COVID-19 regulations that remain in place here in London. At the time of the protest, you couldn't have more than 2 people in a gathering. Right now, it's more than 6. So when you've got thousands of people together, that is a clear breach. But those people who were protesting were there because they were saying that they were acting in solidarity with those protests across America. They moved down Whitehall, past Downing Street, stopping there for a moment to yell at Boris Johnson. It is his residence, calling him a racist, before finishing up here at the US Embassy, the relatively new US Embassy on the south bank of the Thames at Battersea. There were 23 arrests. There were some relatively minor skirmishes, a few flashpoints between police and protesters, but on the whole, it was largely peaceful. People among the crowd saying that they were acting, as I say, in solidarity with those in the US, but also keep in mind that there are huge racial inequalities in Britain as well, and this country is not immune from the sort of scenes that we have seen in the US. Think back to 2011 and those riots we saw across Britain after the death of a black man in Tottenham at the hands of police. Mel.
Yeah, and Hugh, just run us through what's happening in the rest of Europe. Have protests remained peaceful?
Yeah, largely so, and quite solemn in some parts. A weekend of protests in Berlin, including outside the US Embassy there, which is right by the Brandenburg Gate. Protests too in Copenhagen as well. And the plan is for more Black Lives Matter protests to occur across Europe over the next week or so. There's at least 3 being organised here in London over the next 7 days. So we haven't seen the end of them just yet, Mel.
Yeah, all right. Hugh Whitfield, thanks so much for joining us live in London tonight.